Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to carry on our brief discussion about epidemiology and disease course. And on that note, let's have a look at how disease actually begins and how it progresses. For some of you, this is revision, I know, but that's not going to hurt. If you want to, you can just fast forward over this bit. Some of you have seen this slide. Okay, so let's have a look. We're going to start off right here where infection is first occurs. And obviously, this is something like our bacterial growth curves, because we're going to start off with very few organisms. And if they're going to start growing, multiplying, and if they establish a foothold, if the immune system, etc., protective measures don't get them first, and they are able to establish a growing population, then we enter what is called the incubation period. And this is a period when the organisms are establishing themselves, but there are no symptoms and no signs that they are present. This axis here is the number of microbes. So you see that there's very few. It's rather like the lag period that we saw before. Then we get to a point where the number of organisms is great enough that they begin to have some effect, but the effect is perceptible only to the person infected, and it's not perceptible as symptoms. If you have getting a cold, you have this period where something is going on. You can't quite put your finger on it, but you know that something is happening. And you think to yourself, well, I may be getting a cold. This is called the prodromal period, when the symptoms may be entirely absent, but they may be very, very mild at any rate. Now, as healthcare workers in nursing, you need to realize this is very important, that somebody who's been infected may actually have a perception without any signs. Remember that we drew that distinction between symptoms and signs. Symptoms are what the patient feels. Signs are what can be observed. And the patient may say there is something wrong, but I can't put my finger on it. But it just behooves the healthcare worker to pay careful attention, not just to blow that off and say, oh, well, they're just fussing. They quite probably have a good idea that something is happening. It's only in the next period when the number of microorganisms actually develops so high that they begin to cause perceptible damage, that we enter a period of real illness. In this period here, the microorganisms, depending on what they are, of course, will be causing damage to the patient, damaging tissues, damaging physiological function. And this is a period of the most severe signs and symptoms. And they become particularly acute at this period here, which is often where many of the symptoms are caused not just by the microorganism, but by your own immune response. Your own immune response causes things like the headache, fever, aches and pains in the bones, all of these sorts of things. These are all the response of the immune system. They are inflammatory conditions which are part and parcel of attempting to eradicate the microorganism. Eventually, there is going to be a period of decline of numbers of the microorganism, and this is due to the success of the immune system in combating them. But remember also that this is also a period here when a maximum amount of damage has been done to the person suffering from the illness. This is also, in many diseases, is a period of great risk, of severe morbidity, of real effects of the illness, and even mortality. This is a period when you might begin to see in severe illness like COVID-19. This is when you might see death occurring as a combination of the effects of the microorganism and of the immune system. all things being equal, in something like common cold or influenza or something like that, the microorganisms are vanquished and enter a period of decline, but you may still have signs and symptoms of the illness, but they are decreasing. Eventually, the numbers of microorganisms decrease so much that they cease to cause damage, but now we enter a period of convalescence when the patient now has to repair all the damage that has been done. And this, of course, you realize, depends on the illness. This may be a lengthy period. In COVID-19, for example, some people enter a long period of convalescence, which we know as long COVID. So those are the stages of disease: incubation, prodromal, illness, decline, and then convalescence. So having detailed that, let's have a look at how an epidemiologist sees disease as a process in population. So epidemiology is the study of where and when disease occurs, and especially how they are transmitted through and maintained in populations, not so much as in individuals, but in whole populations of people. And epidemiologists attempt to establish where does the disease come from, how does it become established in the population. And to do so, they may need to elucidate how it is established in individuals, but their eye is always on population development. The epidemiologist may also identify important factors that contribute. It is epidemiologists, for example, who have provided a huge amount of information about the impacts of things like smoking, pollution, all of these things as impacting disease in a population. They're intimately involved with developing methods and strategies for controlling disease. They have been essential in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And in order to do all of this, they work with data. They don't work with feelings. They don't work just with hypotheses. They work with data. And there is an enormous amount of statistical work which goes into the study of epidemiology. And we're only going to very briefly just see a couple of sorts of things that they do. But they assemble data, especially graphs and statistical analysis, to outline the incidence of disease. And that word, incidence, is going to acquire a special meaning, as you'll see in a minute. Now, epidemiology is very much a data-driven science. The principal agency in the United States and a world authority for epidemiological studies is the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is the CDC. And they are the principal epidemiological agency. They are part of the NIAID, the National Institute for Allergic and Infectious Disease. And that arm of the CDC actually addresses therapeutic strategies. Still an epidemiological study, but they address therapeutic strategy. CDC collects and analyzes epidemiological information and keep an eye especially on the development of new pockets of disease arising in populations, which may initially be very few people, but the CDC establishes the strategy of keeping tabs on what is happening in that population. And they do so by publishing a weekly bulletin called the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly. So those terms, morbidity and mortality, need to be clarified. The term morbidity means the occurrence of disease and the severity of symptom. And mortality is the occurrence of death. So morbidity is the occurrence of disease, and mortality is the occurrence of death. Now, morbidity may also refer to a constellation of symptoms which are not yet identified as a disease. So the CDC may look and see something is happening in terms of signs and symptoms before a disease is actually classified. And the classic example, of course, is HIV. CDC was the very first agency to recognize that a small pocket of very rare pneumonias called pneumocystis pneumonias had developed in young gay men in the 1980s. And that was the very first warning. It was only about 20-something patients, but it was such an unusual occurrence. It's a very rare pneumonia, usually only occurs in very old people. And here it was in very young, otherwise healthy people. And that was the first notice that the AIDS epidemic was on its way in the 1980s. First identified as a constellation of these strange pockets of pneumonia by the CDC. So let's want to classify, first of all, the difference between these two words. And these are incidence and prevalence. And the incidence of a disease is the number of new cases that develop over time in a specific population. So here we have a graph. This is a graph showing for SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, from February 2020 until August or towards the end of the year of 2022. And this is the number of new cases, of the number of new reported cases per day over that time period for the United States population. So we have a definition, a population, time period, and the number of new cases that are occurring per day. You can also draw up an incidence for other time periods per week or whatever. And you can also draw up an incidence per population. Okay. So, but in this case, it's per day for the whole United States population. And you can see very, very low at the start of the pandemic and increasing in waves as the pandemic proceeded. Now, what's important to notice here, it's only the number of new cases. That is why it's an incidence report. And as opposed to this kind of graph, and this is a prevalence. This is a graph of prevalence of tuberculosis over a number of years. And you can see here the prevalence is the total number of cases measured at a particular time. Okay. So we can do it by year. Okay, total number of cases of tuberculosis in a year. That includes all of the cases that preceded that year, plus the new cases that occurred in that year. That is why it's a prevalence. So it's kind of an instantaneous look at any one time at the total number of people suffering from a disease, as opposed in the incidence to the total number of new cases in that time period. So here, this is actually very interesting because this part of the graph here, you can see there's a little bit of an increase in the prevalence. This probably is preceded by a graph that went like this, pretty rocky, up and down, as people died, as new cases came in. It would vary a bit from year to year to year, but probably all around here. If you went through back down here, you would find there's pretty much a constant overall prevalence. But now look what happens right around here, the first successful antibiotics against tuberculosis. And so the prevalence begins to fall like this. If you were to look at an incidence graph, it may also fall, but you need to take into account a number of things if you are in a situation like that, because the number of cases, the prevalence, influences the incidence if it is an infectious disease, because you have to have a source of the disease. In any case, here you can see the success of antibiotic treatment over the years on the total prevalence of tuberculosis. So that, again, to revise, sorry, I don't know why it's in that. This is an incidence, the number of new cases, as opposed to this here, which is the prevalence, and this is the prevalence of tuberculosis year by year. Unfortunately, there is currently an uptick, and if this is a worldwide, I'm sorry, I think that this is for the United States. If you look at worldwide prevalence, unfortunately, it is increasing. We'll talk about the reasons for that later on. Okay, so we've mentioned a number of things that we need to define. The morbidity rate is the number of people affected by a disease in relation to a specific population for a given time period. So a rate is always by something. This is by population for a given time period. That is the morbidity rate. The mortality rate is the number of deaths from a disease in relation to a specified population in a given time. We would usually talk about a mortality rate for perhaps for the whole United States population. We might talk about a mortality rate for people in a certain age bracket, something like that. But there is a special mortality rate which can be very important, and that is the mortality per case for that disease. Mortality rate here is referring to the whole population, whether they were infected or not. But we can also look at a case mortality rate. And a case mortality rate is the mortality for those people suffering from the disease. And that can be a very important statistic. Now, morbidity and mortality are very definitely linked, of course, because the mortality occurs from those people who are suffering from the illness. So it would be included in it would be influenced by our morbidity rate. Mortality rate will be influenced by the number of people who are actually infected. And you have to look at these statistics really carefully. So let's have a look here. And we see that we see here, for example, two diseases. Here's West Nile encephalitis. West Nile encephalitis is an interesting disease. It is one which is becoming more common in the United States because of global climate change, because it's transmitted by mosquitoes. So the morbidity rate for West Nile encephalitis, which is an inflammation of brain tissue, was 5,674 for the whole US population. It's the morbidity rate for the whole population. The mortality rate for the whole population was 286. So now we compare that to a disease which is perennially present in the United States, a very severe form of food poisoning by an organism called Listeria. And the bacterium Listeria causes sporadic outbreaks of food poisoning. And the morbidity rate, fortunately, is very low. For the whole United States population, it was 121 cases. And the mortality rate was 13. So 13 for the whole population. Now, here's a question. Which disease are you more likely to acquire? Look for that at the morbidity rate for the same population, comparing to the whole of the United States. Well, the likelihood of you getting West Nile virus is very low, but it's much, much higher than it is for listeriosis. However, which disease is more likely to be fatal if you acquired it? Look, only 121 people got listeriosis, but 13 of them died. that is a much higher morbidity rate, much higher mortality rate, sorry, than for West Nile encephalitis. You're much more likely to get West Nile encephalitis, but you're much less likely to die of it than if you got listeriosis. Unfortunately, both of them are currently rather rare. Listeriosis is rare because it is very carefully watched. The food supply is carefully examined for the presence of listeria. One of the interesting things about listeria is that it grows quite well at low temperatures. I mentioned that when we talked about temperature ranges for organisms. Listeria is one food poisoning organism which can grow quite well at low temperatures, even so refrigeration doesn't help very much. But fortunately, it's kept out of, by and large, kept out of the food supply. Okay, so I just want to have a quick word about something which we do hear about periodically and has received an enormous amount of attention during the COVID pandemic, and you will still hear it referred to. And this is this concept of herd immunity. Now, the concept of herd immunity arises very strictly from the study of vaccines, from vaccinology. And it was a concept arrived at when people started to vaccinate widely, and they asked the question, how many people do we need to vaccinate in order to stop a disease? And you may think initially, well, you need to vaccinate everybody. Everybody needs to be immune. They must be immune. They must either be immune because they got vaccinated or because they recovered from the disease and they have immunity that way. But it's actually not true, because let's have a look at how disease actually spreads in a population. So here, the blue figures here are people who are not immunized and still healthy. The yellow figures represent people who are immunized and are healthy. And the people who are in red are people who are actually not immunized, and they are sick and they are contagious. So let's have a look at this population here. No one is immunized. Nobody's either had the disease nor have they ever been vaccinated, and a brand new disease arrives in that population. Well, this would be very like COVID-19 arriving in the population of the United States or wherever. They begin to spread the disease because no one is immune. It can be spread from host to host very rapidly, and very soon it will spread through most of the population. But you may have a few people who are naturally resistant to the disease who survive without being infected. Now let's have a look at the same population. What we're going to do is we're going to immunize people. We're going to immunize a few people, either by vaccine or else they are people who have recovered in the population from a previous exposure. Now we drop in our infectious, our contagious people, and we watch what happens. And we find that it spreads through the population, evading those who are immunized. Why does it spread through the whole population? It spreads because there is enough person-to-person contact between these people that once one of them gets infected, they can infect various other people, often more than one. Those people can infect more than one, and the disease spreads very rapidly, except to those who are immunized. Now let's have a look at a population where most of the people are immunized, but some of them are not. So what we're doing is we're putting in our contagious patients here, and we're watching what happens. Well, the disease has to be spread from person to person. And if you have enough people who are immunized, there is simply no pathway to spread infection to the unimmunized. And they are protected. And they are protected by the mass of people who are immunized around them, who shield them from the infectious people. And very few of them are going to get infected. And this, in vaccinology, was the concept of herd immunity. If you have enough people immunized in a population, you don't have to immunize everyone. And the people who are not immunized are protected because there is no pathway to spread the infection to them. So the question in vaccinology was always is, how many people do you need in a population who are immune to protect the whole population? And it varies by disease. A highly contagious disease, you need most of the people immune. A less contagious disease, you need far fewer to be immune because the disease simply doesn't spread easily from person to person. So this was the concept. And for the disease, of course, which is top of our minds, which is COVID-19, the number, it was calculated, it's probably an approximate number, but nonetheless, they calculated that approximately 65% of the population should be immunized in order to provide herd immunity for everyone. So ideally, you achieve that 65% by vaccinating people. But here, the concept of herd immunity got distorted. And people said, okay, here's our population. We've got coronavirus cases coming in. Should we actually go out and immunize everybody with vaccines, or should we simply let the disease spread through the entire population? Here is a reference for you. You can look up this particular diagram. They are suggesting that all these blue figures here, if we could get them to be immune, then the green figures would all be protected. And you'd need about 65% of people to be in blue. And it was suggested that the easiest way to do this was to allow the disease to spread. Simply allow the disease to spread through the population naturally, and the population will eventually naturally establish herd immunity. It was a distortion of the idea that we achieve herd immunity by deliberately vaccinating people so that they are immune. Then their population plus the population's natural immunity reaches a high enough level that the whole population is protected. Here, they distorted that by saying that we don't need to vaccinate, we just have to let the disease spread. And they said, well, you've got a low mortality rate, so there should be no problem. Well, here is the problem. Let's just look at the math. We've got 331 million people in the United States. We need 65% of those to be immune, to establish herd immunity against COVID-19. That is 215,150,000 people need to be immune. There's a big problem, and that is that the case fatality rate is around about 2%. That is around about 2% of people who acquire COVID-19 die as a result. So if we work that out, we realize that 2%, around 2% of that 215 million odd is 4,303,000 people. So the current fatality rate is above this, by the way. It's now over 1 million. It's about 1.2 million. And that means we've only achieved a small fraction of what is needed to establish natural herd immunity. Those of them asking us to establish natural herd immunity are asking for us to sustain a fatality rate 1,000 times what we have suffered already. In other words, they are providing no protection through vaccination. They are just letting the natural case fatality rate establish at around 2%, and we would end up losing not 1.2 million as we have done, but 4 times that, 4,303,000 people. It is a catastrophic proposal. If you look at the damage that occurred from the pandemic, just from the amount of morbidity and mortality that we had, imagine raising our morbidity and mortality to such an extent that we end up with over 4 million people dying. It would have been utterly catastrophic. So this was a very pertinent cartoon right at the time that the administration was advising that all measures to limit the spread of the disease should be lifted so that it spread as quickly as possible through the population. Fortunately, cooler heads did prevail, and the vaccination program was actually really quite successful. I don't know what the immunity rate is at the moment, but it certainly had a major impact on the morbidity. Okay, so here's another concept to have clear in our minds. Even COVID-19 or any disease requires that there is a constant source of infection for the disease to persist. So I'll give you an example, and that is that in 1976, the disease of smallpox was declared extinct. There are no wild populations of the virus that causes smallpox living on the planet at the moment. There are a few stocks kept in freezers in labs, but there is a strong movement to actually even have those destroyed. So how did that happen? Well, we removed the virus from populations slowly and steadily through vaccination until such time as the very last case was identified in a human being and was removed. Fortunately, smallpox is a strictly human disease, so it is very easy to identify. And so this was to our advantage because we could easily identify people who were infected, isolate them, and vaccinate everybody around them, and eventually reach the point where the disease did not exist in the human population at all. So that meant that there is no reservoir of virus. There is no source of virus to start an epidemic. So that, in that case, worked really, really well. But in actual fact, there are many diseases which occur in human beings, which are where human beings actually act as carriers. Now, I mentioned one of these already, and that was typhoid. Typhoid fever is a disease. It's caused by Salmonella bacteria, and it is always a very serious disease, but relatively easy to treat nowadays. But in the 19th century was a killer disease because they had no antibiotics. But people who recover from typhoid may in fact continue to harbor the bacterium in their gallbladders. And they can, because it's fecal oral transmission, if you can't infect food, whatever, with fecal matter, then it can be transmitted. And these people who are carrying have no symptoms whatsoever. They have an infection because it's present in the gallbladder, but they have no symptoms. But they can spread it, so they are termed carriers. But many, many of our diseases are actually, the reservoirs lie in animal populations. Now, animal being any animal, whether it's mammal, insect, or whatever. And diseases acquired from animal sources are called zoonoses. Zoo because animal, they termed zoonoses. Then there are reservoirs which are non-living, and we'll discuss a number of them in a while. but things like soil, water, food, these may actually be reservoirs for infection and may in fact end up spreading the infection quite widely. So here are some really important zoonoses. The most important of all, and I would venture to say the most important disease affecting human beings, is actually a zoonosis, and that is influenza. We'll learn quite a bit about influenza when we talk about viruses, but influenza is a disease which is endemic to pigs and poultry and to human beings, and spreads between those three hosts constantly and gets mixed up and matched up in passing between them, as we'll learn. There is another disease called rabies, very worldwide, that's quite a common disease, becoming less common because there are good vaccines against it. Rabies is a disease which is spread between mammals. Any mammal can suffer from rabies, although there is some reputation for possums that they don't get rabies. I'm not entirely sure that's true, but most mammals can in fact suffer from rabies. Rabies is a neurological disease, also viral. HIV, of course, is not HIV as that we acquire is actually human to human. It is strictly a human disease, but it originated in primates. Probably thousands of years ago, there was a link between primate HIV and the virus that became human HIV. SARS-CoV-2, our current SARS pandemic, is probably from bats. And I say that because bats, in fact, harbor a lot of these COVID viruses. There are other COVID viruses which we suffer from, which we can get ill from. There are three which cause symptoms no worse than the common cold and are mistaken for the common cold very often. Ebola, which is such a famous disease because it is so spectacularly infectious and has such an incredibly high mortality rate, that is actually originates also in bats. Bats are extremely interesting mammals. They harbor a huge number of viruses for reasons which are not clear. Bacterial zoonoses, anthrax is one of them we've heard about before. Plague, we've also heard about. And then here is one that's really important for people who like to collect birds and reptiles, and that is salmonella. Salmonella and some really quite nasty salmonellas that cause gastrointestinal illnesses are very well tolerated by birds and by reptiles like iguanas, turtles, all of those sorts of things. So if you collect these or you have them, you need to be extremely careful in handling them. When you handle them, don't go kissing your turtle. And if you have handled them, always make sure that you wash your hands carefully afterwards. You don't want to risk either direct acquisition or transmitting it to food, etc. Fungal diseases, we don't suffer from many serious fungal diseases, which are zoonoses, but one of them which is common especially in children is so-called ringworm. It's got nothing to do with worms. It's only because it forms circular plaque where the fungus infected, and it's usually self-limiting. But in children, it can look pretty bad because often they get it on the scalp and they end up with huge bald patches on the scalp. But again, it's often self-limiting and relatively easily treated. Protozoa, there are lots. There are lots of protozoa which we can acquire from animals. And the Giardia is one of them. That is a gastrointestinal illness, often called hiker's diarrhea, because people often acquire it from drinking water that has been contaminated with rodent feces when they're hiking or whatever, and they get thirsty, take a mouthful of stream water or whatever, and acquire this protozoan called Giardia. Another more serious one is toxoplasmosis, also a protozoan, and that its terminal, its host, the host in which it undergoes sexual reproduction, are cats, and it is expressed in the feces. So, and toxoplasmosis has the potential for quite serious illness, and especially because it can become neurological. And also in pregnant women can infect the fetus in utero. So if you have cats and you are at risk, then you should wear a mask when you clean their litter and always wash your hands carefully afterwards. Then there are a number of parasitic diseases, especially helminthic diseases, that is worm diseases. Tapeworm, for example, which we acquire from pigs and cattle, and a number of others which can be transmitted one way or the other between us and even mammals like dogs, if we're unfortunate to pick up any of their feces, any fecal contamination. Okay, so on this issue of transmission, of how we pass a disease from one organism to another, there are a number of different ways. Okay, I thought there was a diagram that with it, but there isn't. First of all, we recognize, first of all, direct contact transmission. That is a close association between something that is infected and a susceptible host. So this is horizontal, called horizontal transmission, and that distinguishes it from direct, from vertical transmission, which is from a mother to a fetus or a newborn. If the mother has some illness and transmits it to the infant or the fetus, that is vertical transmission. Then there are indirect contact transmissions, and where the disease is spread by a non-living object, especially this for healthcare workers, most especially this fomites, which are surfaces with which have become infected, on which the infectious agent can survive long enough that it can be picked up by another host. One of the most important ways of us acquiring disease is via droplet transmission. And this is because even speaking, breathing, let alone sneezing and coughing, we continually broadcast droplets of liquid into the air, usually often invisible, in which agents of disease can survive, both viral and bacterial. And if they are picked up by a susceptible host, they can then establish and cause disease. So the last is transmission, vehicle transmission, which is by inanimate reservoirs. The first, would be airborne, but droplet transmission. The second, waterborne. There are numerous diseases. We've already heard about Giardia, but other diseases such as cholera. Foodborne, very often because of fecal contamination of food sources, so by salmonella, or even staphylococcus, as we'll hear. And then lastly, surface-borne, and those are the fomites, door handles, bed rails, this sort of thing. So diagram form, we have first of all the direct methods. There's horizontal contact. Most of the sexually transmitted diseases would fall into this, of course. Direct contact by skin-to-skin contact of one sort or another. Second of all, airborne droplet. These are direct if you're in very close contact. So if you're within speaking distance, classic 6 feet distance. That was where that rule arose from, because we wanted to limit the amount of direct transmission by droplet. Vertical contact is also direct. That is from mother to either fetus or newborn. Lastly, indirect are the vector-borne diseases. Now, vector-borne disease is one where the organism is not human. It is something else, and very, very often an insect, which is self-infected by an microorganism, and that is then transmitted to a human subject. So this is vector-borne disease. It is still direct. It's from one living organism to another, in this case, human. The indirect or vehicle transmission is, as we've said, either by contact, fomites, door handles, bed rails, tabletops. These are the classic fomites, for example, in a healthcare setting. And it would also include things like bed sheets and all the rest of it. This is one of the really important reasons why hand washing is so critically important in a healthcare setting. It's because you can acquire microorganisms from surfaces that you touch, not only from contact with other patients. Then there are all of the ways in which fecal oral contamination and can result in illness. Food, water, biologic products, all of these can be infected and then be ingested, and that is also indirect. And lastly, there are airborne indirect methods. The first is droplets, again, but these are droplets which last for a long time and where there is no direct contact, you're not spraying people with the droplets, they're actually lasting in the air to be breathed in by somebody who has previously been at distance from you. And there are some, not a lot, but there are a few dust-borne diseases as well. And San Joaquin fever, which you may have heard, those of you who might be from California, San Joaquin fever is one of these dust-borne airborne diseases. So just a quick word about these, about the vectors, because vectors are so important in human disease. In fact, apart from viral diseases such as influenza, these vector-borne diseases are the often major controlling factors on human population. If not historically, they can be even now. The most important vectors are the arthropods, and these especially biting insects, but not only, as we'll hear. But if you think of things like fleas, ticks, mosquitoes, these transmit a plethora of diseases to the human population. So the first way in which vectors can transmit disease is by mechanical transmission. Now, this is the classical thing we learn about when we're at school, about flies, flies going and sitting on feces and then coming and sitting on your food. They can certainly transmit things like that, but the risk is actually far less than we do imagine. It's just a very unpleasant idea to think of. But it can happen. It can happen that flies, for example, can carry pathogens. But there's one set of diseases which are very, very important in developing countries, and this is trachoma. And trachoma is a disease and which is caused by chlamydia. It's the same genus as causes chlamydia as a sexually transmitted disease. But in this case, the bacteria are carried to the eyes by flies, or carried to the face and then transmitted to the eyes when people rub their eyes. And trachoma is a very serious disease, especially in Africa, because it results in continual irritation of the corneas and of the eyelids. The eyelids begin to curl down, and the eyelashes abrade the cornea, which worsens the inflammation, and people end up going blind. And this is a major area of attack by healthcare workers, and especially funded by the Carter Foundation, President Jimmy Carter, ex-President Jimmy Carter's foundation, dealing with trachoma. We'll hear a bit more about it later on when we talk about bacterial disease. But even more important than these, can cause trachoma, or perhaps food poisonings, that sort of thing, are biological transmissions by vectors. And there are just a score of diseases. But they all have the characteristic that the pathogen reproduces in the vector. The vector forms part of the life cycle of the disease-causing organism. And the disease-causing organism is then transmitted to a host via things like bites, or maybe by feces. For example, if you think of plague, which is transmitted by fleas from rats, they do not transmit the bacterium directly by biting you. Instead, they bite you, cause an irritation, you scratch it, and you scratch the flea feces into the wound, and you get infected that way. And so there are a number of diseases that work like that. But the other way that disease can be transmitted, of course, is by biting. But remember that when you're infected by an organism, by a bite, the organism has actually reproduced inside the vector. I say that because people worry about things like a mosquito biting somebody who has a disease like HIV, and then coming and biting them, and can they acquire the disease that way? The answer is no, you cannot. The disease-causing organism actually has to have part of its life cycle develop in the vector. So you and the vector have to form part of a chain of transmission through the life cycle of the disease-causing organism. There are, as you'll see here, numerous diseases like that. We'll hear a lot more about them later. So just for your interest, here is the table you can look through. You don't need to memorize this, but just have a look through and see the number of different diseases that there are that are transmitted by these different arthropod vectors. You'll see how important mosquitoes are in all of these, and malaria remains one of the most important of all human diseases, particularly in having a very high mortality rate in infants in developing countries. Okay, so now here's the last little section that I want, and I want you to cover this on your own. And this is an extra credit, but again, I'm going to require this since you are all nursing students, most of you. I want you just to review the following slides and prepare a maximum 2-page explanation of effective methods to prevent nosocomial infections. Nosocomial infections are those acquired in a healthcare setting, and they are very often transmitted by the healthcare worker. So the healthcare worker in this case acts as a vector for disease. And I would like you to review the slides, look at your textbook as well, and then prepare a maximum 2-page presentation. And that is for extra credit for 1%. I have said here after Thanksgiving, but we'll actually make that later. Okay. You can perhaps hand that in at the last class of the semester. Okay, here are the slides, and they're pretty self-explanatory, so you can easily do these by yourselves. And with that, I'll leave you to your own devices.